Good morning, everyone. To all of you here in person, and there's a lot of you online as well, so we're glad to be able to bring us all together today. Before we started, I just wanted to acknowledge the war that's happening in Israel and in the Middle East. And as I have talked with many of you this morning, and so many throughout the week, it's a really hard time. And I'm so glad that all of us have come together this morning. I see more hugs, which, you know me, I'm a hugger, so I always hug, but to see everyone do that, it says something. And that says a lot. You don't necessarily, I spoke the other night and I said, you don't necessarily need to know what to say. A hug says a lot, or just an acknowledgement. And we'll continue to be here as an organization in solidarity with Israel, in acknowledgement of that terrorism is not okay, that the killing of Jews is not okay, especially as we look at what we're talking about this morning as a topic. The relevance and connection is so important. And so clear to all of us here. And I know that we have a few Holocaust survivors with us this morning, which this is especially poignant and hits right at the heart. So I'm here for you, we're here for you, and we will continue to do our programming so that we bring people together. I'm really thrilled that we're able to have Beth Cohen, Dr. Beth Cohen, here this morning for our annual Alona Irene Rosenshine Holocaust Lecture. We're going to learn more about Irene at the end of this program, but I wanted to mention that Dr. Cohen's talk and all Holocaust education programming we offer at the JCC is a direct result of an endowed fund created by Larry Cohen. It is the Alona Irene Rosenshine Holocaust Education Fund, which if you're interested, you can be part of. I'd be happy to talk to you. We have thousands of donations that have come into that and continue to grow in endowment. Larry and Robin are away, but watching online. Hello. I want to thank Larry for his leadership and commitment to keep the memory of Irene alive through engaging speakers, films, and programs. Dr. Beth Cohen received a PhD in Holocaust history from Clark University and an how do you say it? MED? MED? Great. Oh, thanks. MED in psychology from Harvard University and a BA in psychology from Adelphi University. She has held a fellowship at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where she conducted research on her book, Child Survivors of the Holocaust, The Youngest Remnant and the American Experience, which is the topic of her talk today, and we have available for sale, so if you want, you'll be able to get a copy of it and actually get it signed today. She is a recipient of a number of prestigious awards and fellowships and is the former Director of Education at the Rhode Island Holocaust Memorial Museum. Beth lives in California and is working on her next project that I hope she will share with you. And with that, I welcome Dr. Beth Cohen. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you one and all for being here, both here and online. I want to also thank Nancy Lipsey, Senior Program Director, for arranging my talk, and to Larry Cohen for supporting Holocaust education. It's truly an honor to be here to speak about my work. I also want to give a shout out to my hosts, Judith and Nathan, for having me in Littleton. Finally, I want to especially express my appreciation to any survivors who may be here today, and I know there are some. It is your voices that give life to and animate my work, and they are truly at the heart of what I do. My talk this morning is about those who survived the Holocaust, like Irene. I know she was a beloved figure here in the moving film you'll see after my presentation. But unlike Irene, who was an adult at the end of the war, my focus this morning is on those who endured the Shoah as children, the topic of my most recent book. And I just want to add that my thoughts this past week, as so many of us, have been consumed by recent events in Israel and the inevitable comparisons to the Shoah. So I want to dedicate my remarks today to the memory of Jewish children who've been murdered simply because they were Jewish, both then and today. And it's my profound hope that no more innocent children will be victims in the coming days. When I was interviewing Shep Drazen, who survived as a boy by hiding with his family for 2 years in a bunker in the forests of Lithuania, he mentioned that he used to have a picture of himself from the New York Daily News of his mother, aunt, and himself when they arrived in New York in July 1946 on the SS Marine Flasher, one of the first ships bringing survivors to the United States. Let's see if I got this right. In searching for Shep's photo, which we found, I discovered that many newspapers featured photographs of youngsters' arrivals, showcasing heartwarming welcomes. They provided a very American imagery to a public eager for happy endings to a war, promising beginnings for these innocent victims of genocide. But what was the story behind the images? I soon discovered that the reality of face-to-face meetings between Americans and child survivors was quite a different matter than the rosy media depictions. These encounters, despite mutual high hopes, would prove to be challenging. American Jewry, both relatives and others, so eager initially to adopt or foster war orphans, soon found themselves unprepared for the bargains into which they had entered. The human kindness the youngsters required would soon be tested, and as many children would quickly find sorely wanting. In fact, a recurring refrain I heard from child survivors was, quote, "My war started after the war." And today, using photographs as a starting point, I'm going to return to this early post-war period before children occupied an iconic place as survivors, and highlight child survivors' experiences as they adapted to life in America. But first, I'm going to make a couple of contextual notes. First, about terminology. How do I define a child survivor? Child survivor organizations put the age limit at those who were 17 years old in 1945, in other words, born after 1928, and though imperfect, it's generally the standard I use. In addition, although the term child survivor originated in the 1980s and is not contemporary to the early period after World War II, I use this designation for this group in the post-war era. Secondly, demographics. The early statistics on surviving children were grim. Close to 1.5 million European Jewish children had been murdered. A mere 150,000 survived. Before the war, Jewish children, 15 years or younger, comprised 25% of the overall Jewish population in Europe. After the war, the surviving children represented a tiny fraction, less than 3% of the small survivor community. In addition, there's a common misconception that most child survivors were orphans, but I found that the majority, perhaps 60 to 75%, were not. Most had one surviving parent. An extremely rare number families survived intact, like Shep's, but the majority were at what they called half orphans, having one surviving parent. There's no typical post-war experience for children. Just as age, gender, geography, resources, timing, and of course luck figured into a child's wartime path, these factors by extension influenced where a child was at the conclusion of the war and her future direction. Yet there are patterns that emerge and ripple through testimonies and archival documents that transcend disparate individual narratives. The images I will show you are individual stories, but they reflect larger patterns of child survivors' post-war experiences. In the first place, at the end of the war, children had to be found and reclaimed. This proved to be an enormous and at times contentious task. In every country that had been occupied by the Germans, Jewish organizations, surviving parents, if any, and relatives, if any, searched for children. Surviving teenagers had some agency, but it was much harder to find young children who had been hidden, and often their post-war whereabouts were unknown. To recover them, adults, parents, relatives, and Jewish organizations found opportunities, both formal and informal, above the law and illegal, intentional and accidental, through which reconnections were sought, all amidst the post-war disarray. Some older children were liberated in concentration camps and soon found themselves in displaced person camps. At times, caregivers in DP camps would circulate children's photographs with the goal of reuniting families. Such was the case with 17-year-old Lipod Barkosz. He and his brother Erwin survived Auschwitz. After the war, the pair eventually passed through Kloster-Insdorf DP camp, where their images soon joined the growing pool of photographs. While Lipod's picture failed to yield results, a fellow survivor gave his U.S. relatives Barkosz's details, and they were able to locate Lipod's father's siblings in New York. They, in turn, provided the necessary documents to bring Lipod and Erwin to America. Others turned to the DP press. One mother in Bergen-Belsen placed an ad with a picture of her child. Can you hear? In the Landsberg DP camp's newspaper, seeking information about her young daughter, Stusia Haberman, quote, born in Lodz, deported to Auschwitz in 1944. Stusia was never located. Many inquiries ended not in happy reunions, but in utter despair. Not only the outcomes of searches unclear, but they were time-consuming and often lasted months or even years, sometimes even indefinitely, as was the case with Ray Eichenbaum, a teen survivor of Auschwitz, who remained convinced until the day he died in Providence, Rhode Island in 1995, that his sister Bronya was still alive, but he was never able to find her. One of the first things that the World Jewish Congress and others did was raise funds in the US to support children's homes for surviving Jewish children in Europe. And these often took the form of Adopt a Child program, where the campaigns would encourage people to, quote, adopt a child for a certain length of time, and this would contribute to the child support in Europe. And here's a picture of Gaston Friedman, a boy in a children's home in France that was supported by a Jewish organization, and Mayor O'Dwyer, the mayor of New York at the time, quote unquote, adopted him. And the Jewish organizations would often find known figures or celebrities to encourage other people to give money to help finance the children's homes in Europe. At the same time, American Jewish organizations also sent representatives to Europe to use whatever means possible to retrieve children who had no one to claim them. One group, Rescued Children, was particularly active in the effort to recover Jewish children, sending agents to Europe to locate Jewish children in Gentile environments and remove them to Jewish homes that it financed. Irene Gutman's experiences exemplify this. Irene, a twin, survived Auschwitz, having endured Mengele's horrific laboratory torture. A young Polish woman who lived nearby came into the camp at the end of the war and plucked Irene out. Irene doesn't recall the woman's name or motives, but she believes the woman saved her life. She brought Irene to her farm, where she soon put the child to work. While not particularly drawn to her foster mother, Irene did become enamored of Catholicism at the time. She went to church, found she loved the order and beauty of the service. After about a year, some men appeared and removed her from the farm. After several temporary stops in orphanages, she was placed in a children's home in Foublin, France. Irene's post-war testimony provides her recollections there as an 8-year-old child. Quote, "I would listen as many of the children related their tales of what happened to them and how they got to be here, and many of them were hidden by Catholic or non-Jewish families. Some of them still had relatives and parents and were just waiting to be reunited. Some had hidden with the partisans in the woods. I was the only child with a number. In fact, I was the only child from a concentration camp. So when I heard all the stories that were being told, I said, they're never going to believe where I was. So I never spoke about it. I never spoke about it. Nobody asked me. But I was crying the whole time inside. I was so lonely. I just desperately wanted someone to hug me, just to hug me, and I didn't know how to go about getting somebody to do that." Irene developed a close relationship there with the teen survivor, Miriam, who became, in her words, a surrogate mother. Miriam was going to Palestine, and Irene wanted to join her. Rescue Children, however, had other plans. One day she was informed she was going to America. She recalls, "I didn't want to go to America. I wanted to go with Miriam. She was the only person I felt close to. So this very nice gentleman said to me, 'Well, it would only be for a little while. We'll bring you right back.' I believed him. The next thing I knew, I was together with another little boy who was selected from another orphanage. We were on this big airplane on our way to America." And here's a picture of Irene and the other little boy, Charles, leaving the airplane at LaGuardia Airport in New York. It was featured in the Daily News. Then, Irene continued, "There was a lot of commotion about us. Subsequently, I learned that we were chosen to raise money for the war orphans of Europe by this organization called Rescue Children." Irene and Charles made numerous public appearances that were widely covered in the press. One report was a Life magazine article, "Orphans Clothed." This article focused on the children's excitement of being in New York. No mention was made of the fact that Irene was a survivor of both Auschwitz and Mengele's brutality. Irene recollects, "We stayed at hotels and I saw white bread. I saw things that were totally magical to me. I couldn't believe my eyes. They bought us things, they gave us things. It was unbelievable, unbelievable. But to be honest, I only wanted to go back and be with Miriam and go to Israel. And all these things, the teddy bears, the dolls, the chocolate, didn't mean anything to me." When Irene finally asked, "When am I going back?" she states, "This very nice gentleman said to me, 'We're not sending you back.' They exploited us," she told me. Still, she quickly offered, they really didn't know any better. A family had expressed interest in adopting Irene, and shortly after her arrival in New York, she was sent to spend Shabbat in the family's home. This came to naught. The head of the family reported that Irene was too quiet for them, that they did not wish to adopt her after all. Irene wasn't disappointed, however. She had grown attached to the rabbi and his wife with whom she had been staying and hoped they would adopt her. Shortly after the first failed adoption attempt, however, the rabbi told her she was going somewhere else. Irene recalls the drive there and being left with the family against her will. She remembers chasing the car as the rabbi and his wife drove off. Fortunately, the stay with her new family turned out differently than the previous one. And in Irene's words, quote, "My mother stood by me," adding, "It was a blessing in disguise." Providentially, too, the Life magazine article found its way to a doctor in Czechoslovakia, where, unbeknownst to Irene, her surviving twin, Renee, was living. Somehow the connection was made and Rescue Children was contacted. Irene's new family went to great lengths to bring Renee to America and adopt him as well. At the age of 12, the twins were reunited. Irene went on to become valedictorian of her high school class, studied chemistry in college, married, had 2 daughters, 4 grandchildren. She believed deeply in God. Also, like many child survivors, she divorced and remarried. Occasionally, she spoke publicly about her experiences, although it was always with dread. Memories intruded and haunted her. As an adult, Irene took up calligraphy because, she said, quote, "It took my mind off Auschwitz." Her work, her salvation, as she put it, was included in a book of important women calligraphers. Until illness caught up with her, she created stunning pieces for friends and family. About 20 years ago, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, most likely, she believes, because of the injection she suffered through in Auschwitz. It didn't stop her from participating in wheelchair races to raise money for causes she believed in. She passed away in 2019 at the age of 81. Sometimes reunions between survivor parents and children could be psychologically thorny. The majority of young children who survived have been taken in by Christian families at a young age and lived with their foster family for years. Many had grown close. At the very least, Gentile rescuers were familiar. Biological parents could, depending on child's age and wartime experiences, as well as parents' experiences, could be strangers. Miriam R's separation from her rescuers speak to this. Because she was born in 1943 and given to the Hickets, a Belgian Christian couple, and I know we have at least one person here today from Belgium, she had virtually no memories of her birth mother. Rather, she remembers her foster family as her parents. Speaking in 1997, she recalls the separation as traumatic. Quote, "I remember them with a lot of delight and pain," she commented through tears, adding, "A part of me is still very much connected with them." As an adult, Miriam states she wishes she could have stayed with the Hickets, but as a young child, she was powerless to do so. She recalls going to a train station with a strange man. Later, she learned that the Hickets wanted to adopt her, and an agent from Agudat Israel, an ultra-Orthodox group, kidnapped her from the Hickets. But her mother, an Auschwitz survivor, was too ill to care for her, so she bounced around between several Jewish homes in Switzerland until at the age of 6, she came to New York with her sister, her older sister, who had survived in a convent. The two stayed with few families in New York before going on to a foster family in Detroit, prominent members of the Jewish community. Quote, "It was a haven for me," she remembered. Quote, "I was able to relax a bit there and feel safe. Even so, because she and her sister were constantly fighting, the Detroit family sent them elsewhere, and the next few families were quite different. In one, the girls were used as the family's housekeepers. In another, Miriam was molested. She became very sick and remembers wanting to die. Her life was too horrible to bear. The only good part she recalls was when she was able to escape to summer camp and be a child. Ironically, during this time, Miriam and her sister's photographs was used in the agency's publication as an example of the success of their work in reclaiming children. Finally, Miriam was united with her mother in 1952. By then, she hadn't seen her mother in 6 of her 9 years. Quote, "My mother worked so hard to support us," said Miriam. But Mrs. R struggled to find her place in America. The war had left the woman deeply, irrevocably damaged. Quote, "Her life wasn't normal," Miriam remembered. She didn't trust her own children. You'd think, Miriam reflected, that people that had been victims of the war would make every effort not to fight, but there was so much stuff inside that we all acted out. They tried to survive as best they could, but, noted Miriam, it was anything but harmonious. The girl, her mother, and sister were all deeply scarred. Try as they might, they could never piece back or remake a stable life together. Miriam and her sister and mother battled constantly. At one point, after a disagreement, Mrs. R called the police. As a result, 16-year-old Miriam was placed in a Jewish home for delinquents. There she encountered everything from drug addicts to prostitutes. Finally, after a suicide attempt, Miriam was hospitalized. This, Miriam states, was a fortuitous development. Her doctor treated her for over 20 years and helped her rebuild her life. She put herself through college and graduate school, which she believes would not have been possible without her doctor's help. Eventually, she became an accountant and traveled widely. Miriam kept away from her family for most of her life. I spoke with her in 2018, and she told me that shortly before her mother's death, the two met. The pair were able to talk without rancor. She's pleased that they spoke about the father she never knew, and is happy that she and her mother were able to make peace. Miriam's retired now. She spends much time appreciating nature. She loves to hike and is a serious bird watcher. Along with many child survivors, she attended the first Hidden Child Conference in 1991. Connecting with other child survivors for the first time was life-changing for her, and she remains active in the local chapter. She speaks with students and finds much satisfaction when her experiences resonate with troubled youth. Miriam still has a conflicted Jewish identity. She states that she is spiritually connected to Judaism and considers herself Jewish, but is not religious. She never married, nor did she restore contact with her sister. I'm going to skip ahead. Okay. Excuse me for 1 second. So here is an example of children who were orphans, but they went to American relatives. Here are two, Miriam and Alfred Friedman, featured in the Decatur Review. The newspaper reported how Dr. and Mrs. Schlosser, the children's maternal uncle, and his wife had gone to great lengths to bring Mary and her brother Alfred to the United States. They eagerly took the pair, quote, into their homes and lives. The Schlossers, already parents of a 2-year-old son, emphasized their generous determination to give Mary and Alfred every opportunity they possibly could for successful lives. Unfortunately, Mary's stay was over in a matter of months. Born in Antwerp, Mary was 4 when the war started. Her memories of her mother are dim, but she recalls holding her hand as she and her brother were taken to a monastery, which had an attached school for wayward Catholic girls. Even though her life was saved, the nuns were not kind. She remembers but will not speak about their physical abuse. After the war, she was removed to a Jewish orphanage, and she believes her mother was one of 8, and one of her mother's surviving siblings knew where she was and was able to find her. Nearly 50 years later, Mary reflected on her beginnings that so vastly differed from the promising newspaper account. Though the Schlossers professed commitment to their niece and nephew, from Mary's perspective, it fell short. Though they professed commitment, it fell short. My aunt, quote, didn't have the time, nor did my uncle. Perhaps they didn't have the desire, she suggested. Less than a year after the Decatur Review pronounced the children, quote, dream come true, the Schlossers shipped Mary to her maternal aunt and uncle in Detroit. Trying to understand her relative's abrupt turnaround, she explained, quote, I was quite feisty and in school disruptive. She hoped the second family would give her the attention she craved, but they were working people, and they too did not have the time or energy to invest in their niece. Quote, basically, I was alone, and even though I had people, I didn't feel accepted, she said, and added, that was a pattern throughout my life until I became an older adult. Before long, she was living in a group foster home. From there, a Jewish family took her in so that Mary could care for their children. By the time she graduated from high school in Detroit, 7 years after her heralded arrival in Illinois, she lived in 4 different places. Nobody, she stated emphatically, wanted an orphan. Mary moved around a great deal as she grew up, noting that she struggled to find her place in the world. She did eventually become a nurse. She also attempted suicide and was periodically hospitalized. She eventually found happiness and married a man later in life who was not Jewish, and she experienced yet another loss when he passed away. She never had children. In addition, Mary and Alfred were not close once in America. She looked to him as a father figure, and he did not embrace that role in his sister's life. However, they did grow closer as older adults, and she maintains a good relationship with his children, particularly one of her nephews, who is a rabbi and head of a Holocaust center in Brooklyn, New York. Recently, I spoke with Mary, who just completed a memoir, and she told me she's in, quote, a really good place. She also said that she feels that her story is about her Holocaust experiences, but it is also about recovery and resilience. And she deeply hopes her memoir will help others struggling with depression, as she did. She takes much pleasure in her log cabin home in Idaho, her few good friends, and being close to nature, like Miriam. Perhaps because her years in convent school were so dire, she does not embrace Catholicism, but neither does she have a particularly strong Jewish identity outside of her relationship with her nephew. In March 1948, the New York Times reported, quote, on the 250-acre estate of the late Robert Brewster, once the scene of flower exhibits and teas, 70 refugee youths from Czechoslovakia will live, learn farming and handcrafts, and study the tenets of the Jewish faith. End quote. The Mount Kisco Yeshiva Farm Settlement, as it was called, was the brainchild of Rabbi Michael Dov Ber Weissmandel. Rabbi Weissmandel had been a leader of Slovakian ultra-Orthodoxy, a representative of the World Agudat Israel organization, and part of the Nitra Yeshiva before and during the war. One of the last surviving European yeshivas that had been completely destroyed in 1944. Rabbi Weissmandel came to America alone in 1946. His first wife and 5 children had been killed in Auschwitz while he had escaped from the train en route to the camp. According to observers, he was deeply depressed over his family fate. In his own perception, he had failed to save the European Jewry as part of the working group, an underground rescue effort, and as well as American Jewry's inability to imagine the unimaginable and respond to his pleas for money. According to Rabbi Weissmandel's friend, Rabbi Kolodny, his experiences left him broken. Within a year of his arrival, however, Rabbi Weissmandel declared, quote, there is an obligation on the few who are left to build anew a religion. He was determined that the only way to do this was to continue the tradition that had been ruptured by the Shoah and establish a Nitra Yeshiva in America. By all accounts brilliant, he had studied ancient manuscripts at Oxford in the 1930s. Rabbi Weissmandel came up with a novel plan. He would bring young survivors from Europe to his new yeshiva that would combine Torah learning and agriculture. The boys would study half of the day and spend the rest of the day farming in order to support themselves. Initially, support for his plan was not forthcoming. Still, he persisted. Finally, he raised enough money for a down payment on a rural estate which had been in foreclosure. By March 48th, as the New York Times reported, the youth settled in. Philip Herzog, who is now head of the Baron Herzog Wineries, if any of you are familiar with that, was 10 years old at the end of the war and came to America in early 1948 with his family, who had been close to Rabbi Weissmandel in Slovakia. His memory of visiting Mount Kisco for the first time are vivid, as are his impressions of the man. Quote, he was a genius. He knew everything, mathematics, English, languages, Hebrew, science, Herzog recalls, adding, quote, a man like that comes down on earth, very few in 1,000 years. About the other boys, mostly orphans, he states, quote, when they came from the war, they were wild animals. Most lost father, mother, sister, brothers, uncles. They had nobody. According to Herzog, Rabbi Weissmandel, quote, came out with this fantastic idea. Have chickens, have cows, let them work 2-3 hours so that they could stabilize their heads. Another boy, Jacob Spitzer, was liberated in Theresienstadt and came to the United States with his mother in 1948 at the age of 12. He remembers, quote, we were looking for institutions that would help us rebuild our heritage, and by then I knew about Rabbi Weissmandel. I found out about his yeshiva, and I headed there. He stayed for 5 years, eventually receiving rabbinic ordination. Regardless of their varying paths to Mount Kisco, the former students were unanimous in their admiration and devotion to the memory of their teacher, who died of a heart attack in 1957 at the age of 54. Said Rabbi Spitzer, "It was the highlight of my life just being in the presence of Rabbi Weissmandel because, quote, it was like a resurrection of my recollections of my hometown in Hungary." Even more, said Rabbi Spitzer, quote, "Rabbi Weissmandel instilled in us a great sense of responsibility, that it was on our shoulders to rebuild, and everyone our age had to replace 100 of what was lost." He and his classmates took that charge very seriously. Rabbi Spitzer has 6 children, 46 grandchildren, and numerous great-grandchildren, all, according to him, religiously observant. Comments, Mr. Herzog? "Thank God I knew these kids and they grew up to be fine people. They married, had children. Rabbi Weissmandel," he emphasizes, "gave them life again." While the school did not succeed as a farm settlement, laughs Rabbi Spitzer, it wasn't practical. It did take root as a yeshiva and exists to this day. Finally, I want to circle back to Shep Drazen, who is here in the picture, the person whose story I began with. Shep and his family, as I said, are a unique example of a family that survived intact in hiding for 2 years. First, with farmers, where after a few close calls, they were moved to an underground bunker in a forest. While there, his father, who was a Hasidic rabbi, made a tiny calendar to mark Shabbat and the holidays. Shep recalls making matzah for Pesach in their hideout. Over his wife's protests, the rabbi insisted that his 7-year-old son study Torah while in the bunker. The family survived in the forest along with 4 relatives, spent months in the Fehrenwald DP camp in Germany, and finally settled in Providence, Rhode Island. When he was a teen, his parents sent Shep to a yeshiva in New York. Later in college, he met his future wife. Eventually, they married, relocated to Los Angeles. He ran a successful business and raised 2 sons. Now, Shep's retired. He plays tennis weekly, travels widely with his wife, and attends synagogue every Shabbat. They're deeply involved in the lives of their 2 children and 6 grandchildren. He seems remarkably well-balanced, and his wife attributes this to the fact that his entire family survived. An astonishing piece of luck and resourcefulness. For his years, Shep did not talk about the war, but this changed when his grandchildren asked him to speak to their classes. In a recent talk, he told his audience that every year, when he reads the Passover Haggadah, quote, "My mind always goes back to the war. We lived the 10 plagues during that time. There was blood, there was lice, there were boils, there was darkness, and of course, the slaying of the firstborn." In conclusion, in my presentation today, I drew upon post-war images as a starting point to illuminate child survivors' beginnings and their initial encounter with the U.S. society that was often fraught. Through later testimonies, we know that the young remnants of European Jewry, by and large, moved forward. For some, this was a piecing together of fragments rather than a seamless progression. Some had families and meaningful careers later on. Even later, many embraced a unique identity as child survivors and found purpose engaging with students and others. Some found solace in creative endeavors. Others did so through the belief that they participated in rebuilding the destroyed world of their origins. Still, these examples remind us that the residue of their Holocaust experiences followed and shaped child survivors long, long after the war ended. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. If anyone has a question, we want to use the microphone so that the people on the live stream can also hear the question. So there we go, Mark.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. It was very illuminating and interesting. My wife and I saw a movie not too long ago on a streaming service called HiFlix, which was about child survivors who were relocated to Switzerland from Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And In the movie, it seemed like there were about 30 of them, of kind of all ages. I'm just wondering if you're familiar with it, and if you are, if you could comment on its truthfulness. We had no idea as to whether such a thing happened, and especially in Switzerland. Thank you.
Well, I haven't seen the film, so I can't really, comment on the accuracy of the documentary. Certainly, there were children moved from Bergen-Belsen after the war, and I'm more familiar of the case. In fact, have interviewed and included in my book a story of several stories of children that were sent to Sweden after the war. And that was much more common because Sweden opened its doors to survivors, and thousands, including many children, went to Sweden. But there were cases, for sure, of children that were taken other places, such as Switzerland, and I just can't really speak to the details of the film.
Name of the film? Remember?
I'll look it up as soon as...
Beth, I have a follow-up question related to that.
Yeah.
Is this the case when groups went to countries that the country opened up their doors and they organized for their own internal refugee services, organized for children to come?
Yeah,
or was it Jewish organizations within those countries?
Well, it was a combination of both, thank you. But speaking about Sweden, they, as I said, they took in perhaps 10,000. The numbers are exactly aren't known, but they worked with Jewish organizations in Sweden and governmental organizations as well, and set up schools. There's, I actually researched a school that was also a religious school that was started in Sweden outside of Stockholm for girls. Very unusual story, and about 150 Jewish girls were taken, went from concentration camps to Doverstorp in Sweden, and the Jewish community in Sweden was very concerned because the Swedes were wonderful to the children, and children started acclimating to Sweden and socializing with the broader Swedish population, and there was a concern in the Jewish community that they were going to acculturate and to assimilate. And there certainly are cases of some children that did assimilate into the Swedish society and intermarried and are still there. But most of the children went on to either Israel or the United States or elsewhere.
You mentioned that 150,000 children, more or less, survived. Do you know how many of them came to the U.S. and how many there are still alive?
Yeah, numbers are really tricky. And it's interesting, after the war, at the end of December 45, Truman issued a directive that allowed 40,000 Jews to come to the United States, and he specified that he wanted 1,000 orphans to come in. And so we know that we think about 1,000 came during that first year, and then 2,000 or 3,000 the following year. And then when the DP laws changed in 48, about 140,000 survivors came to the United States, we think. Many more came as parts of families or on their own. I have talked to the Claims Conference and other scholars about numbers, and we think that it could be as many as 40 or 50,000 came to the United States ultimately. How many are alive now? You know, I've tried to get this number from the World Federation of Jewish Child Survivors, but not all child survivors are members of these organizations. So I would say, and that's just in the United States, I would say at least 10% less that have passed away, because the youngest of child survivors now are well into their 80s. And
Can I follow up on this a little bit? You talk a lot about coming to the United States of child survivors. But I was wondering, how much information is known about Canada? I mean, I think there were quite a few survivors who came from Europe after the war to Canada. But I'm not aware of really a lot of similar information as we have for the United States as Jews who then came to Canada. And my understanding is after the war, Canada was one of the first countries, actually, for the United States to accept survivors, particularly children.
Beth, I need you to be at the microphone for the live stream.
I have heard a slightly different story, and I would refer you to my colleague, Adara Goldberg, who's Canadian, has written a book specifically on survivors who went to Canada, and has spoken, but Canada was not so welcoming to survivors and to child survivors, as far as I understand it. But that's not the area of expertise, so, but I would refer you to Adara Goldberg's fine work on Canada.
So, how many children went to Israel? I'm connected with Hadassah, and they talk a lot about the youth Aliyah program back at, oh, actually, that was also because I know that started in the 30s.
In the 30s, yeah.
In the 30s. How many went to Israel, either during, pre, or post World War II?
You know, it is so hard, really, to come up with numbers. And I will say it's interesting, some of the Holocaust organizations are insisting on the number 6 million for Jews, but in terms of talking about other victim groups, et cetera, they're talking about millions, but not applying exact numbers. And as far as the number of children that went to Israel, I would say, you know, the majority did go to Israel, and I would say, you know, over 100,000 went, you know, out of the 150,000. Many went to kibbutzim. There's a wonderful film called Under the Domim Tree. It's an Israeli film, and it talks about the absorption of child survivors into Israel, and specifically into kibbutz life. But, you know, the focus of my work has really been the reception of survivors in the United States and child survivors. However, I have many colleagues in Israel, and I've talked to people who went to Israel, and there were similar experiences. And also, there were some who went to Israel and then during the austerity period of the 50s ended up coming to the United States because life was so hard then. So there was, actually in both directions, there were also people that went to Israel, but anyway, that answers your question.
This is our last question, and then we're going to make a little transition. Go ahead.
I'm curious if you encountered in your studies and covered children who were taken in by families, Christian families, passed off as their own in order to hide their identity. And then after the war, many of those families said, no, these children are now Christian children, and we're not going to give them back to the surviving parent, especially if there's only one surviving parent. Did you encounter that, and did you cover that in your book?
Yeah, I talk a little bit about, I do talk about that a little bit in my book. I will say this, that you know, among scholars, there's a sense that there are thousands of Jewish children that were never recovered. You know, because neither their parents survived, relatives didn't survive, and because they were hidden, there was no address for their own protection. Their addresses weren't written down, or In the case of many people I've interviewed, they were in multiple locations. They were in one location and then, they got a tip that neighbors heard that there was a Jewish child in the area, so that they were sent somewhere else, and then from there somewhere else. So, it was very hard to track down children. And for sure, I spoke about Miriam and her experience with the Hickett's, and she found out that they wanted to adopt her. And her mother, her mother was working in a factory, and a co-worker knew that she had a child who was with a Belgian Christian family, and he was the one. I was fortunate to discover case files of Agudat Israel, of the caseworkers that were working in Belgium at the time trying to recover Jewish children. And after about a year, they said it was so hard to get some of these Jewish children away from the family that they had to give up. There were instances of court cases. The Finale brothers were an example that was in the New York Times, and eventually the children were removed and they live in Israel now. But it was a very, very complicated period, and the reclamation, recovery of Jewish children was enormously complex. Thank you for that question.
Mark just let me know that the movie is called The Labyrinth of Peace, and it's on HiFlix, and which is a Jewish film streaming service that those of you who know Catherine Bernheimer, our film festival director, she is a big fan of that, the Netflix of Jewish films, and that movie is called The Labyrinth of Peace.
Let's all give a big thank you to Dr. Beth Cohen. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your work. We really appreciate it. After we do a little presentation, her books are available over by AC. She'll be there to be able to sign them. But we're really honored today. Irene's 3 children, Bev, Gail, and Karen, are all here with us today, which is a really special treat. And I'd love to invite Bev to come up and join us to share a little bit. Here, let's walk around so we don't trip. Share a little bit about her mom, and we also have a wonderful film to be able to share as well. So thank you so much.
I'm Bev. I'm Irene's oldest daughter, and I'm just going to speak for a minute to say my mother was indomitable. She was a person who went through hell but chose life. She had a 6th grade education, but throughout her life, even though she was in emotional pain, she always chose to be forward thinking. And we as a family are very honored by Larry's endowment. My mother, who again only had a 6th grade education, would never have believed that she would be the recipient of such an honor. And we are very thankful to Larry Cohen. Thank you.
My name is Irene Rosenschein. I was born in Kirahaz, which is the Carpathen. My father was a butcher. He had 2 butcher stores. We had a very large family, 5 boys and 5 girls. We lived a very simple life. Everybody was struggling to make a living. Most of the Jews in our town were either tailors or shoemakers, dealers. My favorite thing was riding the bicycle, going to the Tisa in the summer to the river and swim and bathe. It was wonderful. During the Sabbath and the holidays, we used to go and hike into the mountains. Even though we were dressed very beautifully in Sabbath clothes, we had a beautiful childhood, very loving, great respect, never any fights or quarrels. Things began to change when the war broke out in 1939. Within 2-3 months, things started to happen to the Jews. By late summer, around Tisha B'Av, they deported hundreds and hundreds of Jews, marched them to the railway stations, loaded them in cattle cars, and they took them away. We didn't know where. Within a month or two after this, there came out a law that all Jews needed to wear stars. I remember 2 neighbors who lived across the street from us, and we were very friendly. He used to come over and talk to my father for hours. And all of a sudden, they would not talk to us, they would not come over. It was like we didn't exist. In the morning, men used to go to the synagogue to pray. Townspeople would put on their beards and beat them up. Young boys the same. And they used to go into Jewish stores and just loot the store in daylight. It was just terribly frightening. My mother never let us out. She was terribly scared for us that we might be molested. My father died in February of 1944. 10 days later, my sister Valerie came from Khust and told us that the situation is getting very bad and we will probably be deported. The last moments leaving our home forever is one of my hardest things. I ran into the stable and I kissed my wonderful, beautiful cow that I loved. Her name was Muncie. And I kissed the cat, which was I just adored that cat. We were marched to the nearby city of Nocholish, and that was the ghetto. We were assigned a room with 3 other families. We were a total of 4 families. In one room, that is. Each room had 3 to 4 families. 4 weeks into the establishment of the ghetto, they started to transport people out of the ghetto, families, complete families, like 400 to 500 a day. They gathered us the day after Passover. They had us march to the railroad station. We passed through forests and farm countries. And I remember once or twice they would not wave to us, but they would take their hand and they would show us like this, that we are going to be slaughtered. After 3 days, we arrived to Auschwitz. And that was a terrible shock. We could see buildings. They had gigantic chimneys, very, very tall chimneys, many of them, many. And there was a terrible flame coming out from them and a terrible stench. Some men approached our train and they spoke Yiddish. They said in a low voice, "If you have a child, give it to your mother. If you have a younger sister, she should go with your mother." As we went another few feet, maybe another 5, 6 to 7 feet away from the cattle car, they were officers, German officers. We knew we were doomed. We were all being separated, and there my mother just left, holding my little sister's hand, and didn't even say goodbye to her. And then the 3 sisters, Haichu, Esther, and me, we entered this big room. They told us to sit down on a chair, and they removed our hair. And then they directed me in another area to undress, completely naked. We were pointed at a heap of clothes. We picked up a dress, no panties, no bras. We were left barefoot, and we were led into a block, which was number 19. Within a few days, we were covered with lice. We were talking about whether we could ever see our parents again. A woman was pointing to the chimney, and she said, "That's where your mothers have gone. Stop carrying on." And when I see the gorgeous sunsets here, I compare it to the red to the red himmels, to the red skies that were continuous there. Somehow it just tears my heart out. The selections were held about a week or maybe a few days after we arrived, to line up in rows of people, one in front of the other. There stood Mengele with other SS, men and women. We had to raise our hand, and I was completely naked, so he could see if I had any muscle left, of the ribs, of whether they still had any covering of flesh. He would point to the right. Those were the condemned people. I, including my sisters, we went to the kitchen on the garbage dump, and we would take peels of beets and rub it on our cheeks to make our cheeks look more alive. One particular time, there was a selection of very healthy-looking, blonde, stramme, hoge girls, which means very, very good-looking, healthy-looking, blonde women. And not many will be selected. So it will be a very special selection. I was selected, and a few others were selected, a total of about 27 or 29. We were led to the very front of the lager, where it said Arbeit macht frei. This is the first time that I ever left my sisters, that we, the four of us, were separated. And at one point, I had a feeling that we weren't watched very carefully. So I started to back off, and I started running. Luckily, there were still many people coming and going, so I could not be detected that easily. When I came to my sister, they couldn't believe their eyes, and there was a very emotional few minutes. Within 2 weeks, we were selected out of the camp. We were on route for about 2 days, not knowing where we are going or what will happen to us. And we worked in a factory, and we could see large, gigantic, big letters, Siemens Electronics. We did that all day for 12 hours. And we were there until about January, the end of January. 1945, the Allied forces really made up their mind to destroy the German factories and production of military supplies. So we had 3 times a day bombing. The Siemens factory was completely destroyed, so they divided us into 2 different groups. Valerie was taken away from us and into another group. We didn't want that. We just couldn't take any more, and we carried on terribly. I carried on especially. I went up, there was a 3rd floor. I ran up the staircase and threatened to jump from the 3rd floor unless they let Valerie come with us, or we should go with Valerie. Therefore, many civilians were standing around and watching what was going on. The SS came up and forced me go down, and I refused. So they pushed me down, they threw me down the stairway into the basement and started beating me and kicking me, and consequently I have a crack in my skull which is here forever. But after this incident, they did let Valerie come with us. At the beginning of May, we had small, tiny little windows, and I look outside and I see some men are crawling on their bellies. They are holding on to a rifle and crawling on their bellies in a long ditch. I put my hand, and he motioned me, put his finger on his lips, motioning me to be quiet. I put my hands together in prayer, and I showed him that I am grateful. Within 4 to 5 minutes after this incident, you could hear shots ringing out. Revolver, rifle shots, and they killed all the guards. They came in to our place, to our building, and they said, "We are free," and that tomorrow afternoon the Americans should be arriving with their tanks. The first time in our lives that we had ever seen Americans. The feeling I cannot describe. When we arrived to the shores of America and we had seen, they pointed out Ellis Island from the distance, and then we had seen the Statue of Liberty, and we all broke down. I met my husband in April of 1948. His family, the Rosenshines, they all perished. Everyone. We fell in love, the biggest blessing in my life. I have 3 daughters. I know they are affected by my life and by Felix's terrible loss of his family. But I would like him to be happy and go on like any normal American would.
Stories are so important. Each of us have them, and I know when I look around here, many of you have family that were in the Holocaust, and many of you have your own stories to share, and we always want to hear them. Irene's is a really special story and very connected to us, and that her memory will always be part of this community. And thank you to her family that's here. And if anybody, again, wants to participate in helping continue the legacy of Holocaust education here at the JCC, you can go to boulderjcc.org/donate, and you can choose this fund. Again, there are thousands of donations that have come into it. It is over $50,000 at this point, and continuing to grow. So thank you for being here. Again, you can have the book signed today by Dr. Beth Cohen, and may we all continue to share with one another so that we can live with never again.